All right. Thanks, Dan. And thanks, everyone, for attending. My name's Warren McKinney. I'm with Streamline Technologies. And during this webinar, we're really going to focus on our FloodWise application, talk about real-time flood forecasting and how we're using this application to shift from the reactive response during these severe flooding events and moving towards a more proactive readiness with thoughtful planning. And one of the questions that we get quite often is, well, one, why do we need the system? And I think a lot of us, especially the folks in Florida and along the Gulf Coast, are very familiar with the rising risks that we're seeing with these climate disasters. If you look back from 1980 to 2024, over that period, we saw around 67 hurricanes, fairly substantial, 203 severe storm events, and 45 billion flooding events. And this equated to over $2 trillion in damages from these flooding events since 1980. And these numbers have been adjusted for inflation up to 2024. Also, we've seen over 10,000 deaths, which is fairly substantial considering looking at these events, and even one death is too many. And we want to make sure that we're able to better be prepared or be better prepared during these events. And one thing that's really interesting or that's been observed over time since 1980. So from 1980 to 2024, the average of these events was around 7, but the annual average over the last 5 years is 25. So it's drastically increased over the past 5 years. And if you want to look at these impacts spatially, we're just looking at a map of the United States. And these are the billion-dollar climate disasters with this heat map. The more red, the more significant the impact. And just for total transparency, this includes all disasters, not just flooding events. This includes drought and freeze as well, and winter storms. But the vast majority of the impacts are related to flooding events. And I just want everyone to really focus in the Gulf Coast. And we see 3 states that are extremely red. Florida, this is not necessarily the category that you want to be number 1 in, but Florida ranks number 1 in the cumulative cost from these events. And we're over $450 billion over this period. And they're largely due to hurricanes. Texas is a close second with approximately $436 billion since 1980. And then Louisiana is coming in at third with around $314 billion. A very significant amount of impacts, and all of this from these 3 states is primarily focused from these hurricane impacts. The overall disasters in general, flooding impacts accounts for about 80%. And this table provides the same information, but really you can visually see moving down the table. You can see we start with 1980 and we're going in 10-year increments, and just see how the costs have been gradually increasing. So from 1980 to 1989, we were looking at around a little over 3 events per year that equated to a little over $219 billion of impact. And then when we moved down, say the 2000s, from 2000 to 2009, we've doubled the number of these impacts and also doubled the cost. But then when we start moving into the last 5 years, so 2010, 2019, we saw $994 billion, a little over that. But in the last 5 years, from 2020 to 2024, you see the number of events increased to 23. So this is almost over 7 times what happened in 1980, and the cost is over $740 billion. And we're seeing this steadily increase. And in the past 3, you can see that in those 3 years is over half of what happened in the past 5. So we're seeing this trend. And one of the questions we asked is, well, let's look at the climate data and see what it exactly is happening. And if you look at the climate data over the long term, the average rainfall tends, or the average annual rainfall tends to be fairly constant. There's a little bit of variation, but it's averaging out. But what is happening is the extreme events are becoming more severe. So we're having high intensity rainfalls during the wetter times, and then we're having drier periods during the drier times. But those higher intensity rainfalls are resulting in significantly more flooding. And if we look at this in locations across the state, if we look in Florida, we're seeing about a 12% increase in Miami over time for these higher intensity events. That's a fairly substantial increase from around 1970 to 2024. Work our way through the Gulf to New Orleans, they're seeing about a 9% increase. And then when we make our way to Texas, they have the largest increase in these high intensity events at around 22%. And again, these higher intensity events, they're causing more flooding, more flash flooding, and the extents of these flooding events are getting more substantial. And I know from personal experience in Central Florida, where I'm located at, during Ian, the amount of rainfall that my community received exceeded the 500-year event, which none of us expected. But inland, the rainfall-driven flooding is only a portion of the picture, or part of the picture, because in Florida, we don't only have the rainfall, we have tide and surge, which is another major component of flooding. And looking at the global trends, we can see in these, the vertical axis is the millimeters, just so everyone's aware. We're starting back in 1880 all the way up to 2020. And you can see there's a steady upward trend. And if we look at the increase in the tide and sea levels along the Gulf Coast and the East Coast, we're seeing these upward trends throughout the area. And with higher tides means a higher tailwater, higher surge, which can increase the flooding. And this can cause more nuisance flooding as well during sunny day, whether it's a high tide where your storm sewer is surcharging and flooding out a road, or even during a king tide. That flooding tends to be occurring more and more often, and there's a cause for concern. If we look at the general trends, looking in Miami at Virginia Key, we're seeing it about a little over 3 millimeter per year increase from 1931 to 2025. And if we extrapolate this, if you look out 100 years, this would be equivalent to a little over a foot increase. In a relatively low-lying area in this key, a foot increase can be very detrimental. In the Louisiana area, in Grand Isle, Louisiana, there's a little bit fairly significant. It's almost 3 times what we were seeing in Virginia Key at about 9.1 millimeters per year from 1947 to 2025. And then over a 100-year period, we'd be looking at approximately a 3-foot increase. A very substantial increase just thinking about tide in these coastal communities. And if we move to Texas, to Eagle Point, this probably has the most significant increase at around, on average, from 1993 to 2025. Again, this is a much shorter duration of period of record, but we're seeing about 12 millimeters per year. And if we look at that increase over 100 years, that's approximately 4 feet. Significant change. And if you're looking at the tidal increase as well as the increased intensity, those two combined are having significant impacts to communities, especially during these catastrophic events. So knowing that with FloodWise, our real-time flood forecasting system, and people always ask, why don't we need it? Well, with this application, it helps us be more proactive and make informed decisions during these events, because a lot of the discussions that I've had with emergency managers, public works departments, utility departments is, if we know 1 to 3 days in advance, what could you do in that time to prepare for the event? And these are some of the main things that we've talked about, are anticipating road closures. If you know a road is going to be closed, you can go out and place signage to let everybody know they need to take an alternative route. If there's going to be flooding to the point where it's impacting homes, you can pinpoint evacuations, issue voluntary evacuation orders to allow the residents to evacuate and mitigate the impact to the greatest extent possible. Communities themselves, during these storm events, they typically will distribute some type of flood protection, whether it's sandbags or a flood wall deployment. They have limited resources, and if they knew exactly or where areas were prone to flood, they can strategically allocate those resources to the communities that need it most. A lot of times, in what I've seen, and I was one of those people, when we see an impending hurricane, we tend to panic. And if there are sandbags that are available that a city or county are providing, we all tend to go and we get the sandbags that we're allowed to obtain and bring them back to our house for protection. But that's a finite resource, and sometimes what happens in some instances is the people that have those sandbags aren't necessarily the ones that needed that flood protection. And once that resource is depleted, then the other areas are definitely more susceptible. If you're in a community or have a water system that has operable control structures, you can optimize the management of those structures in order to maximize storage in the lakes and ponds to mitigate the flooding. And most importantly, with a system like this, knowing where and when flooding is going to occur up to about 3 to 4 days in advance, you can plan the response sooner, as well as plan the recovery efforts much sooner. So you can pre-position your recovery teams to go into the community to help people recover their lives much more quickly. And the whole intent of this application, when it was developed, was we want to make communities more resilient during these storms, because with this information, they can prepare prior to the event to be more specific about their coordination and how they're going to react to this event in order to mitigate the flooding as much as possible. And this may be something as simple as moving cars a couple of blocks down the road to prevent those automobiles from being impacted and having these the community file insurance claims. And finally, to plan the recovery efforts much more quickly and effectively. So that process moves much faster and much more quickly than we have in the past. So how does our system work? And it's fairly simple. What we have is our FloodWise application. And this is, you can think of this as a control center. This is what is taking forecasted climatological data as well as tide and surge information from NOAA. We take that information, we process it, we format it, we actually archive it as well, so we can do a hindcast if necessary. And then we take this data, and FloodWise will send it to StormWise, which is our proprietary H&H model. Those of you that have used StormWise or ICPR, has been available or has been around since the 80s. It's FEMA approved and accepted. It was actually the first proprietary model FEMA accepted. But that is the numerical engine that is doing all of the calculations for the flows and levels. This model runs 24/7, 365, so it's continuously running. We have about 14 systems running right now. So all the time is continuously running. It will take the calculated stages and flows and then send that information back to FloodWise. And then FloodWise will use that stage and flows information to send it to our outward-facing dashboard. And our outward-facing dashboard is pretty intuitive. I'll go into some details of the system, but this is what users who have FloodWise work with and are leveraging to make their decisions during these events. In our dashboard, we work off of a concept called flood risk points. And a flood risk point, you can just think of it as identifying a location where you want to assess risk. And it can be really anything, and we tailor it to whatever the community's needs are. We do use AI and deep learning to generate these flood risk points. And then the points themselves, they relate back to our computational network where we're determining the stage at each of these points. Typical locations where we create these flood risk points, almost all the communities we work with want to include streets. They sometimes want to include residential or houses and structures. Utility departments, they really it's really critical for them to include their assets, whether it's a lift station or master pump station. They want to know if these locations are prone to flooding, and if they can prevent any type of flooding impact to these facilities is critical, because in a lot of cases, these facilities are millions of dollars. So saving one would really pay for this system several times over. And of course, you want to include your emergency management assets as well. Also, hurricane shelters of importance, nursing homes and assisted living and medical facilities are very critical as well, and also schools. Again, we pretty much tailor these to whatever the community's needs are. So once our flood risk points are placed and they are connected to our computational network, the way that we identify flooding is we use a simple color coding system: green, orange, and red. So green, you can say green is good. It means there's no flooding. And orange is an instance where the flood elevation at a particular flood risk point is indicating that there's shallow flooding. So if it was a residential property, it may be indicative of yard flooding. It's not in the structure, but you're observing some shallow flooding in the area. If it were a roadway, there's enough flooding that the road may be partially inundated, but it's shallow enough that it's still traversable by a vehicle. You just have to be careful driving down that roadway. And then if it's displayed as red, that indicates there is deep flooding, where it's in the structure, it's at or above the finished floor, or the depth along the roadway is deep enough that the road should be closed down and look for an alternative route. A foot of flooding with a high enough velocity on a roadway can wash a vehicle off the road. And if you select any of the flood risk points from the dashboard, you'll bring up information about what type of flood risk point, so you can see that this is a utility. It will also specify three different elevations. It shows the real-time stage. This is a calculated stage from a real-time simulation. It will include a warning stage. This warning stage is what we internally set at indicating shallow flooding, and then a alert stage, which is if the stage at the flood risk point exceeds this elevation, this would be deep flooding. If you select the flood risk point, it will generate a graph on the right side of our dashboard, and you can actually see the flooding over time, or the stage over time. Usually there will be up to 3 forecasts. We run 1 forecast each day. And these are based on the forecasted climatological data and tides. We'll have a real time, so this is a live model that's running the real time flows and levels that runs continuously. And then you also have the ability to run alternatives as well, which I'll cover a little bit later. But what I really want to just focus on is kind of relate this graph back to the symbology. Is if we look at the alternative sim, which is this green polyline or line, you can see if this stage exceeds this dashed orange line, which is the warning, then the point flood risk point would display as orange. But since this stage exceeds this red dashed line, which is the alert, indicates significant flooding, the point is displayed as red, which indicates or shows there could be a potential problem at this location. And the system itself is very intuitive, and that's how we design it. We designed this system with the intent that you don't have to be an engineer or H&H modeler. It's really designed so to extract information from the system. You can run what if scenarios that you probably want to coordinate with engineer to see how you could modify your system to mitigate the flooding in order to collect more information to make informed decisions. And again, the flood forecasting, FloodWise, can predict flooding up to about 4 days. In most cases, you're probably going to be in the 2 to 3 days range, but we've had several case studies where we've been able to predict the flooding up to 4. For our flood risk points, just to kind of elaborate a little bit more on those, this is a new feature that we've developed, or new functionality. The flood risk points, we actually have them identified depending on, or symbolized based on the particular facility that they represent. So it's very easy from the dashboard to filter the system. If you're wanting to just look at utility assets, or if you're wanting to just identify, say, schools and universities in the area to see if they're impacted, you just go to the dashboard, pull up your flood risk or your table of contents, and you can actually toggle off the features you don't want to include and just identify the ones that are important to you. And then in the system itself, if let's say that a hurricane or severe storm is anticipated and the system is predicting flooding, you really don't have to look at this system hourly or every 6 hours. We'll actually send out a notification anytime a flood risk point is indicating shallow flooding, which is locations where the stage is exceeding that warning elevation, or locations where the stage is exceeding the alert elevation at deep flooding. So anytime that occurs based on the forecast, a notification will be sent out, either text or email or both, depending on what the user is opting in, and they'll receive that notification. Most of our users prefer to use the email as opposed to text messages. But once you receive the notification, it'll include a link to the dashboard. And then once you click on the link, it'll bring you to the dashboard. You log in with your credentials, and everything is username, password specified. So no one can access the dashboard except assigned users. And then they can go to the dashboard and evaluate where the flooding is occurring and make a determination if it's necessary to do any corrective action, or it may be something with the forecast of rainfall is indicating there's going to be more rainfall than what is a local forecast is anticipating, and you can determine on how you're going to respond. And I have some case studies. I also want to kind of talk about some financial impacts, and we're just going to focus on Hurricane Ian. That was, I don't want to say it's too recent, but it was fairly recent storm event in Central Florida that caused significant damage. It was a Category 4 storm. The winds were up to about 155 miles an hour. It impacted Florida in September of 2022. The storm itself, you can see, was the size of the hurricane was almost the entire extent of the state of Florida. So anywhere you were at in the state, you had some type of impact from the storm, whether if it was just heavy rainfall or the winds itself. And again, it costs $112 billion worth of damage in Florida and widespread flooding. So, and just imagine 112 billion with a B. That's a very big number. If we were able to prevent even just 10% of the damages caused by this storm, making minor informed decisions on how we're going to react, whether it's temporary flood protection or if it's simply just moving cars or things like that, we could have saved 11.3 billion, still a very large number. And this is one of the case studies, and those of you who've seen some of the presentations we've given, Orlo is probably one of the best examples of why a flood forecasting system is necessary. Orlo is located in Central Florida on the west side of Orange County, just south of West Colonial Drive. What's interesting about Orla Vista is that it's a landlocked area. There's a lake, and the only way water can leave this watershed is via pump station. It's a flood-prone area that the county is aware of, and this is actually one of the first flood forecasting systems we put together for the county. And since this system is landlocked, we have a fairly detailed model for the surface water model, and we included a groundwater model as well. Since it's landlocked, you do get some recovery in the system, be a groundwater flow, but the majority of it is from those pump stations. And when we went through the development for this model, we calibrated it to Hurricane Irma, so it was operational during Hurricane Ian. And during Ian, the system was closely monitored, and we Streamline ran several rainfall scenarios from the dashboard just to collect information on the storm so the county could make a decision on how they wanted to respond. And during Irma, the system predicted the flooding up to about 3 days in advance, or 2 to 3 days in advance. And it was indicating that there was going to be substantial flooding in the area. There was roadway flooding that was predicted, as well as flooding of the properties. After the storm, we ran a hindcast to see how accurate our flood-wise was compared to what actually occurred, and we were pretty much right on the money with what happened. This is a couple of the photos just indicating this is the flooding and what the system identifies. So this is Hope Circle, and we're looking south. You can see there's substantial flooding in the area. And then just moving a little bit to the west along Ronnie Circle, also we're showing this road is underwater and also significant flooding of the properties, which is consistent with what was observed. In the county, based on the information that was provided from the dashboard, issued a voluntary evacuation for the area. So this is one of the success stories where the residents knew it was going to flood. So they went in and made sure the residents were aware and they could evacuate the area. Since Hurricane Ian, the counties actually went through a project of upgrading the pump system, also expanding the storage in the lake to mitigate the flooding in this area further. So they're being very proactive too about improving the stormwater system in this area for these residents. Another case study is Little Big Econ. I'm going to preface that this floodwise system was not in place during Ian. We developed it after the storm as one of our pilot studies just to verify how the system would have responded. To familiarize you with the area, University of Central Florida is to the east. This is University Boulevard. This is Rouse Road. And those of you that are familiar with it and watch the news, you are probably fully aware Rouse was there was a fairly substantial impact aroused with significant flooding to the residential properties, as well as there's a nursing home right here just to the south. Our system was consistent, again, with what was observed in the area. It was pretty substantial. I remember watching the news in particular during this storm event and seeing EMTs evacuate residents from the nursing home walking through waist deep water because of how significant and widespread the flooding was in this area. Students were impacted during the storm. This is Arden Villas. There's actually another apartment complex as well, and you can see flooding was fairly widespread, and there are a lot of cars in the parking lot that were impacted during this storm. And if they'd have known beforehand, they could have possibly moved those cars to lessen that impact and avoid those insurance claims. But what our dashboard is showing is displayed is consistent with what occurred during that storm. And then the third case study that I want to go over is Bonita Springs. Bonita, this is just to illustrate another one of the capabilities with the tide and surge, but with Bonita Springs, unfortunately, they were hit fairly hard in 2017 with Hurricane Irma, and then in 2022, they were also impacted by Ian. And with Bonita Springs being in the southwest portion of Florida, they are very susceptible to tide. One of the things that was pretty interesting with Bonita is when Irma impacted the area, a lot of the flooding was rainfall driven because they received around 15 inches in that area. And a lot of the flooding was just west of I-95 and just to the east. But during Ian's path, it kind of went a little bit further north. Bonita's down in this area, and they were impacted fairly substantially by surge. So with our system, what we can do is we can ingest the tidal forecasts, and like with the rainfall inland driven forecast, again, we'll have a real time as well as up to 3 forecasts, and we're modeling the inland hydraulics and the surge at the same time, accounting for that compound flooding, because if you just evaluate the tide as an individual component versus the inland, you may not be accurately identifying the total extent. So it's important to take both into account, which is what this system does. And then with Ian, based on our forecasts, you can see the blue is the real time. This green line is the USGS gauge that's located just east of 95. And the max stage of the forecast was very close to what was measured. We also ran a couple what if scenarios for this particular storm, but it was again showing more, giving us more confidence in the system because it's accurately representing what occurred during that storm event. Some of the benefits, and I'm going to also talk about the what if scenarios, and I kind of hinted to this previously. Our goal with FloodWise, first and foremost, is to protect people's lives. That's what I like most about what I do, and that's what keeps me coming to work every day and working with the people. We have a great team, and everybody has the same mindset. We're helping people every day with this application, and we want to make sure people are protected during these storm events. That's priority one. Priority two for us is also providing fiscal benefits to our community as well to prevent any type of financial impact, whether it's to the residential property or if it's to the county or city infrastructure. Because in the end, if something is impacted the community ends up bearing the cost through taxes. And depending on what is impacted, it could have a very detrimental impact to the community as well. This is one example off of Rouse Road. This is that same area where we're illustrating or showed the flooding at Arden Apartments, as well as I talked about the nursing home in this area. But another interesting or important feature is that there is a master pump station that is owned by Orange County Utilities at this location. The Rouse Road master wastewater pump station, in fact. During Hurricane Ian, the flooding damaged that pump station facility. A lot of the electrical components were damaged, and it actually took quite a long time to repair the pump station too, to get those components. But the overall repairs for that pump station was exceeding about $8 million. And when we spoke with the utility director at Orange County Utilities, he said, man, I wish I really would have known this beforehand. I would have deployed tiger dams to protect this pump station so we didn't have to bear this financial impact. And just giving us, this is really showing us the importance of this system. If the county themselves, they have over 200 of these facilities across the county, and being able to protect one of these facilities provides a huge fiscal incentive to the county and to the residents, so they won't have to pay for those repair costs. And they would have known this up to 42 hours in advance as well. Plenty of time to go out there and place the tiger dams. Another thing that I alluded to a little bit earlier with the area around Rouse Road, there's a lot of apartment complexes, a lot of student housing, and they were impacted greatly by Ian. You can see, I was talking about before, all the cars that were impacted at Arden Villas, and we also have the place at Alafaya, and you can actually see the oil and gas plumes in the water. These were losses that could have been avoided if they'd have known beforehand by just moving their cars a couple blocks down the road. And let's just do a rough estimate. Let's say we were able to save 200 cars, and I'm going to estimate the cost of a used car being $10,000. And I'm being generous with the $10,000 because I don't know where you can buy a $10,000 used car anymore. But let's just say if we were able to save 200 cars by moving them at $10,000, that's a $2 million benefit, where those insurance claims would be reduced or avoided by just simply moving the cars. I hear a lot of times, sometimes with residents, and they say that during the storm we couldn't have done anything to prevent the flooding, which to some extent I absolutely agree with them on some instances. But we can always move a car. You may be able to remove some of your precious assets from your house to try to prevent as much or mitigate the damages as much as possible. Let me go back. And this is in the same area. This is Arden Villas as well. Again, this is after the storm. And that is a college student standing in the water with it above her knees. So you can see how substantial the flooding was. And looking at this this pilot study, and we've been working with Orange County for a while, they made a request, which after they made the request, it made absolute sense on why they would want to do this. In a lot of instances, local governments, they will deploy portable pumps in these emergencies to help the floodwaters recover more quickly in order to help people be able to access their properties and just start the cleanup effort. So an enhancement that we recently incorporated into the system was the ability to place temporary portable pumps into our FloodWise system. And these pumps are in the model, but they never operate under normal conditions. They're off. They're just preemptively placed in the computational network for our H&H model. And we coordinate fairly closely with Public Works and a lot of their field crews as well to, one, determine what pumps they have available, and two, they know based on their knowledge of their service area where flooding occurs, how often they pump these areas, where they pump from, and where they pump to. So we will go into our Stormwise model, and then we preemptively place these portable pumps in the system. And again, they don't operate under normal conditions. They're off. But if the area is being impacted by an impending storm and the county or city sees that there's going to be an impact, what they have the ability to do is, based on the forecast information, they can actually go in and turn these pumps on as they need to see, one, if they can use the pumps to provide more storage in a particular area to mitigate the flooding, or turn on the pumps to see how fast the flow waters can recover as well, using what we call a what-if scenario. They can also turn on these pumps in the real-time scenario to actually match the actual physics of the system during these events as well. So they can, if they go out and they implement or they place these pumps and they start pumping, for the real-time simulation, they can turn them on to take that pump operation into account. So it's a really nice enhancement that we added. And after, like I said, after they mentioned it to us, it completely made sense and really makes the system powerful. We've also fairly recently started incorporating gate operations as well for some of our clients, because that was one of the features of importance, where they can modify the gate operations for the real time. They can also run what we call what-if scenarios with the modified gate operations to evaluate how the system would respond and see if they can mitigate flooding. And a nice thing too about the what-if scenarios, which you run from the dashboard, is you can run the alternative or that what-if scenario, and not only do you see what the benefit is to the area of interest, you can also determine if you're going to have any adverse impact downstream by running that analysis. So very powerful functionality. And luckily for us, the county in this particular case, they have the same types of pumps, so it was really easy to incorporate these into the system. Okay. Now let's talk about, I'm going to wrap it up with some acceptance and some benefits for Floodwise. So with acceptance, there's pretty widespread uses in the state of Florida. We have the Upper St. Johns River Basin. With St. Johns River Water Management District, we're actually currently working on the Middle St. Johns Basin. Orange County, Florida has two instances of Floodwise in place for two of their watersheds, one actually being the Little Big Econ watersheds, as well as Orla Vista. We have a couple Floodwise system in South Florida with Martin County and Bonita Springs, and then a system in Hillsborough County for one of their watersheds. In Manatee County, I think they're probably our most active user. They have almost their entire county covered or included in a Floodwise system at this point. And currently we have about 14 Floodwise systems in place. By the end of, I think, next year, we'll probably be close to 20 systems in place. But we have at least two of the St. John's is leveraging the system. Southwest Florida is currently developing one of their systems now. So both of the water management districts are working with Floodwise at the point. And then and then we have several counties that are using the floodwise system as well. And the system itself, I mean, you really only need an existing H&H model to get the system started. And our underlying computational engine, of course, Stormwise, and in the state of Florida, that's one of the most widely used H&H models in the state. So if you have an existing model, it's fairly easy to spin it up. And we're ingesting real-time and forecasted climatological data and forecasted tide and real-time storm surge and tides constantly. We're downloading it, we're compressing the information, we're archiving it so we can run hindcasts when necessary. We've also incorporated the ability to ingest USGS stage data and St. Johns River Water Management District stage data as well. We're looking at essentially any municipality or water management district or any agency that has a gauge system with telemetry where we can connect to an API, we can ingest that into our system for our real-time and our forecast simulations. And again, the dashboard itself, it's designed to be very intuitive. You don't have to be a PE or a modeler. Again, you just you're using this as a reference to collect data and make informed decisions during these events. And in having the ability to easily conduct the what if scenarios, whether you're turning pumps on and off or any of the other functionality we have for what ifs, really sets us apart in the capabilities with this flood forecasting system. And to prepare the community, like I said, it's now really all you really need is an existing H&H model. If you have a legacy ICPR3 model with geospatial data or a Stormwise model, EPA SWIM model, we can get those systems spun up relatively quickly. We do, in some instances, have to simplify and optimize the model depending on the complexity of the H&H, because with these forecasts, you want to make sure that the system runs fast enough to get the results in a reasonable amount of time. And that is one of the critical steps that we start with first to see if we have to optimize the system. Everything is placed geospatially from the hydraulic network to all the base data information, whether it's an underlying surface. We have automated approaches to develop the flood risk points, leveraging open source data to the greatest extent possible, and it's obtaining data from our clients when it's necessary. And we take care of all the forecast data. We also go through a rigorous calibration validation process just to verify that the model is an accurate representation of the system itself for the forecast, and developing a very detailed testing process. And once we finish our testing and we're meeting all of our key performance indices for this, indicators for the system becomes operational and we turn it over to the client. And this is just a summary of all the benefits, but I'm going to stop here and I'll leave this slide open and see if anyone has any questions. And thanks again for attending the webinar.
Thank you, Warren. If anybody has any questions for Warren about anything that was covered in the presentation today, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section, and we will get them in front of Warren to be answered. Warren, it looks like there's already one in the Q&A. I can read it off to you. Is the information resulting from the flooding modeling / analysis going to be published or become public in the specific government agencies?
So the information itself is owned by whoever we have we developed the dashboard for, and they disseminate the information, how they determine what's necessary. I would advise against having it open to the public, because as an engineer and a modeler, and I've been doing this for several decades, I understand the underlying uncertainty in flood forecast information and the hydraulic network. So you want to be conscientious of how the information is being distributed, so you're clearly providing the correct message. So for now, I think is from my perspective, it should be limited to the people that are the owners of the dashboard, and then they will manage through their EOC on how they convey the information that's being produced.
Looks like we got one more. How was building FF elevation data obtained?
It depends. If finished floor data is available, then it's obtained directly from that data set. And there's a lot of different applications. You could actually, well, you can use AI too to extract it from PDF files if it's analog. But if available finished floor data, if the finished floor data is readily available, we prefer to use that. But let's say finished floor data is not available. Well, we partner with our parent company, WGI. They have a geospatial division that has a lot of experience processing LiDAR data, 3D, and what they've been able to do with analyzing the point cloud, they can determine what the finished floor is based on the point cloud data fairly accurately.
Keep them coming, guys.
Sorry,
Warren. We got one more in here. Keep them coming. If you have any more, drop them in the Q&A there. Could you use this tool being integrated into real-time control of stormwater treatment to limit overflow and maximize water quality improvement?
I don't see why you couldn't, because our focus is on flooding, but really this is live modeling. It's running 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. So you could monitor the water levels in those critical facilities, just to, for your point is to make sure you're not affecting the water quality.
Got one more here. Any existing Stormwise/ICPR4 model works? I'm imagining that it would need to be 2D for gridded rainfall/ET inputs, but many watershed studies are done in 1D in Stormwise.
So most of the models are 1D actually, and you can use distributed rainfall based on a grid with 1D. But we do have some systems that are in 2D. That Upper St. John's RTFF I mentioned, that's the 2D model. Also, part of the Bonita Springs RTFF, the eastern portion of that model is all two-dimensional as well. So it can be 1D or 2D. We typically, if we can have the model set up as 2D or 1D, we prefer it because it tends to run much faster than a 2D model, but we do actually set them up based on what makes the most practical sense for those applications, for those instances.
Looks like Matt would like to know, can this information be utilized to perform flood studies for FEMA or county floodplain admins?
So I'll say that we could use the models that are developed in Stormwise as part of the NFIP to develop floodplains. We could leverage those in FloodWise for flood studies. And I'm assuming, well, you could also utilize the floodwise model we develop for flood studies, but usually the stormwise model comes first. So you already have the H&H model for your FEMA flood studies. We're just leveraging that for the flood forecasting.
How often will the model need to be updated given the development pace in Florida?
As often as the client wants to update it. So that's a good point, because as development is pretty rapid in Florida, well, in several areas of the country, and the topographic voids that come along with those introduce some uncertainty. And I would personally recommend that whoever the owner of the system is, evaluate the frequency of how often they want to update the model network to incorporate the new development. Because I know one of our clients, that's what they're going through right now. They're taking developments in some of the critical areas and incorporating those into the floodwise system so they can better identify the risk in those particular areas. But it's really up to our users on the cadence of it.
How are you calibrating / validating if flood-prone area does not have available gauge data? Are clients collecting data to improve model performance over time?
So a lot of the communities have repetitive loss, and actually they have to require that. They're part of the CRS rating system or CRS system. And we use that in some instances. If they have high watermark databases too, some government agencies maintain that data. We leverage that as well for the calibration validation process. A lot of times you have to be a little bit of a detective on finding accurate or data that you can actually calibrate to in some of these instances. But we really try to find as much data as possible for the calibration and validation of the system. And they can always, I know some communities too will add gauges after the fact, and we can always ingest those into the system as well, and to help with the accuracy of the forecast in the real time.
Questions keep on coming in, Warren. We got probably time for one or two more here. Alexander asked, which NOAA product are you using for forecasting? Why once and day products instead of a product like HRRR?
So I'm not going to disclose exactly what we're using. I'll say it is one of the forecasts, but the HER product is another one that we're evaluating. I think there's benefit in using multiple products and not just limiting it to one. And I also think there's advantages to having multiple forecasts instead of a single forecast a day as well. I'll say that that is on our radar and something that we're looking at.
What is the time step of the input rainfall series when you're forecasting? Hourly, sub-hourly?
It's hourly. The rainfall is hourly.
And then lastly, are the watershed models from the WMD or from FEMA or elsewhere? How do you ensure the watershed models are up to date? You might have already answered that.
So most of the time our clients, so there's a very clear distinction. So we're a software company. We don't really get involved with the model development. And we're really focusing on implementing the flood forecasting system. And if someone approaches us regarding a RTFF or floodwise system we want to develop, then they're really the ones that are supplying the model. and they'll have to make the determination on if it's suitable for their needs. And most of these models, like you're probably pointing out, it has a date certain, and even if the date, let's say if it was constructed in the model with date certain was 2025, I know it's probably not up to date now because the new development has come in. But that goes along with that maintenance, that question before. They're going to have to go in and start adding regular maintenance to these systems. What we do in these cases, we do a evaluation of our flood risk points. A lot of it is we use deep learning to do some of the QA/QC, but we also look at the flood risk points manually as well. The deep learning, it will look at change. It has a change detection that we're looking at versus it may be the land use change. It also looks at the underlying DEM, where we can go in and we can identify areas where either the computational network or the underlying DEM are not consistent with what the recent aerial imagery is showing. For example, if a development actually is shown in the recent imagery, in those cases, we will typically not include the flood risk points, and we'll identify it as a topographic void. And that really is providing our client or our user a reference on where the model needs to be updated. So we're trying to prevent any false flags in those cases as well. So it's really important to identify those topographic voids.
All right, guys. Well, that's all the questions that we've got in the Q&A. I'm sure if there's any more, I'm sure there are. We're going to be sending out a webinar recap here shortly over the coming days, so stay tuned for that. There'll be Warren's contact information in there, along with the recording of the webinar. So if you have any additional questions you're too shy to ask, or they come up later on, feel free to send Warren a direct email, and he'll work on getting you an answer back to that question. Thank you, everyone, for joining our webinar today. Thank you, Warren. This was great. Everyone have a great rest of your afternoon.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you joining.